So it's my pleasure to welcome John Teton.
Even though Jenny and I decamped for Portland years ago, we feel that we are dual citizens with all the privileges there too. It is a privilege to be a Santa Barbara. Let's face it, Santa Barbara is what paradise wants to be when it grows up. This is a blessed place. And this was driven home to me in a new way recently when I heard a radio interview with animator Floyd Norman. Norman, now in his 80s, still working, was asked how he became the first African American to score a long-term job as an artist with the Walt Disney Company. He replied, well, it was easy for me to reach for the stars because I grew up in Santa Barbara in the 1950s, where my family suffered no racism and the sky was the limit. The interviewer, you could hear, is a little skeptical. He said, your family, a black family in the 1950s, suffered no racism there in Santa Barbara? He said, absolutely not, none whatsoever. Well, that might not have been true for every such family, but what an enchanted place that at a time when vicious racism and Jim Crow laws were darkening 1 million square miles of the United States, a child like that could grow up here confident that he could make his dreams come true, a dream that had been impossible for black people before. So it got me thinking, maybe there's something about drenching a place in optimistic sunshine that psychs people up for a moonshot. And maybe it's no accident that Santa Barbara's given rise to a movement that has a real shot at triggering the end of world hunger. Now, moonshots are thrilling, and when America accomplished that original moonshot, we were thrilled about it. And we still are. And because success has a way of expanding people's sense of what's possible. The astronauts hadn't even returned to Earth before people began to say, well, we can walk on the moon, we ought to be able to end hunger on Earth. And that's quite true, as long as people recognize that hope is more than just shining eyes. When Barack Obama first ran for the presidency, he said, hope is not blind optimism. He said, rather it's imagining and then fighting and struggling for something that had seemed impossible before. To thrive, hope has to be backed up by action. Otherwise, it falls susceptible to false paralysis. That's what happens when people frame their view of the future based on the limitations of the past. It's a good thing babies don't think that way. When we're babies, we've never, at a certain point, never taken a step in our lives, but we see what we want to do. We imagine, we struggle, we stand up, and we get on with it. Nonetheless, unfortunately, some 13 to 17 years later, most of us developed some mental paralysis about world hunger. I believe I did, because we've been steeped like tea leaves in the idea that hunger is just part of the human condition. Governments kind of like that, gets them off the hook. I mean, no way you can fight the human condition. But when governments have the will, they find a way. They certainly found a way to fight terrorism after 9/11. And imagine the overdrive they moved into if there'd been another attack that bad on 9/12, and another one 3¼ hours after that, and every 3¼ hours ever since then to today and ongoing, plus another 400,000 such attacks, each with 3,000 victims instead of being killed, were left crippled by illness. But those, unfortunately, are the proportions of the real world nightmare of malnutrition that leaves millions of people, families like this, destroyed. There are more casualties from hunger and malnutrition than in all the years of the Nazi Holocaust. There are more deaths and disabilities from malnutrition than from all the world's wars and crimes put together every year. And there's collateral damage to the well-fed as well, because high death rates lead to high birth rates, something a lot of people don't realize, and that leads to overpopulation and its spin-offs of environmental damage and political instability. And then there are the troubling doubts that we try to convince ourselves that, well, we have to shrug off hunger because, well, you know, that's just the way it is. That was the mindset of a George Packer essay in the New York Times once rewrote. You've done nothing about hunger, nor will you. You feel perhaps without being conscious of it, an infinite guilt, the mental residue of millions of suffering human beings for whom we've done nothing. Now, this paradigm of helplessness before hunger is a self-imposed curse. It's at odds with the facts. It's psychologically debilitating. It mires humanitarian impulses in a slew of too little, too late measures that leave nearly 1 billion people malnourished, millions of who die from it every year. We proud developed nations have developed a split personality problem. America most of all, one personality, you've heard this before, boasts we are the greatest and most powerful nation in the history of the world, while the other, for some reason, meekly joins a global chorus of political leaders, in effect whining, well, that lady with the necklace seems nice, but we can't help it if she starves to death. That's just the human condition. I don't have much patience with that. The only condition that we're strapped with is the one that some teenagers in novel upsurge call ADS, acceptance of avoidable death and suffering. A disease that cripples the spirit of whoever's got it and the body of somebody else. Due to ADS, malnutrition kills at 6 times the rate of HIV/AIDS and afflicts 20 times as many overall. But there is no death more avoidable than death from hunger. Hunger's not lung cancer. It's less daunting than the common cold because there's a perfect preventative regimen for it, and a cure, and it's called food. And experts have long agreed that there's enough of that to go around, and that governments have long had the ability to end hunger. But because of ads, the best they've come up with so far are some underfunded development and emergency food programs, and some flowery declarations like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which at least declared the human right of access to food to be a human right. That was something. But there is a cure for ads. You can ask consulting Dr. Amartya Sen, he's a Nobel laureate, world's leading authority on the economics of poverty, and he has long maintained that in the modern era, nobody starves unless somebody wants them to. Somebody like, say, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, who uses starvation as a weapon that stretches out agonizing deaths hundreds of times longer than deaths from bombs and gas chambers. You can also consult the late epidemiologist Jeffrey Rose, who pointed out that the primary determinants of disease are social and economic. So the treatment of world hunger requires the legal and socioeconomic prescription of human rights law. And that means hard law, not the high-minded but toothless declarations that pose as laws but have never been enforced. And of course they haven't been enforced because nobody ever bothered to provide for enforcement in the first place. So, until now, human rights law enforcement has dared not speak its name. UN declarations on the right to food have enforcement-free loopholes big enough to plow 20,000 freshly emaciated corpses through every day. Now, granted, enforcement-free law has a temptingly low upfront price. No reason to spend a dime on courts, prisons, police. So, who's up for dropping enforcement from the laws against armed robbery, rape, and murder? Well, nobody, and maybe that's because, as Justice Duke Ellington might have opined, if it ain't got that legal axe swing, it don't mean a thing. Nonetheless, at the 1996 World Food Summit, axe-phobic governments, including the US, refused to strengthen the right to food in law, opting instead for another aspirational declaration. But they had a plan, and the plan was to cut the number of hungry in half over 19 years. That's a pretty faint-hearted call to arms, and faint-heartedness leads to the kind of mindset that, not surprisingly, led to them missing the target by 300 million, a target which, even if it had been met, would have left 500 million people still hungry. But declarations can prove useful if they they are taken as foundations to build upon. Abraham Lincoln understood that when he spoke of the right of equality in the Declaration of Independence. He said, quote, "The drafters did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying equality. They meant simply to declare the right so that enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit." Well, folks, we're a sixth of the way through the 21st century, and it is prime time for a paradigm shift. Circumstances are beginning to permit enforcement of the right to food, and they brought us together this evening to discover the key to the world's most deadly problem. The International Food Security Treaty aims to catalyze a global commitment to fulfill the human right of freedom from hunger and to protect it with enforceable international law. The draft treaty can be found at treaty.org. It's only 700 words, but it distills down to basically just 4 principles. Each signatory nation is obliged to guarantee access to minimum nutrition to anybody within their borders who can't get access to it on their own, to contribute to a World Food Reserve and Resource Center to assist any nation that needs emergency help to meet that guarantee, to establish and enforce law against the use of starvation as a weapon, and to support UN food security enforcement actions if it's proven that some nation is unwilling or unable to enforce that law on its own. There's a realistic path from here to there also at treaty.org. Phase 1 was about building an overpowering case for the treaty with support from many experts and visionary leaders. Now we're in phase 2, where the treaty has to be formalized by nations, facilitated by the UN, and later phases will focus on gathering ratifications, building the treaty infrastructure, and pressing for universal compliance. Universality is a tall order, but the treaty can make huge strides and impact along the way. If just 1/3 of the world's nations are committed to it, we'll see sharp drops in hunger. And that will increase the momentum for universality. Now you might well ask, how well grounded is this? Well, you don't have to just take my word for it. At treaty.org you can find rousing endorsements for this treaty from both of your United States senators and other seasoned realists in Congress, human rights, international law, religion, and experts like Amartya Sen, and the UN leader who led the global response to the famine in the Sudan in the 80s. He has said that the IFST is potentially the centerpiece of a whole system by which the capacity of the earth to feed its people is translated into a real commitment to do something, because there's no fundamental need for hunger now. There's a comment by President Obama's mentor, the late Abner Mikva. He's a seasoned realist, member of Congress, White House counsel, chief judge of the DC Appellate Court. He was the first person in Washington to see this treaty. And he wrote, "This treaty makes the utmost sense. It must have teeth. Another pious platitude in favor of eating will not accomplish the task." And you'll find Senator Feinstein's observation that the IFST could become a major element in stimulating global action to eradicate starvation and in strengthening the international justice system. And you'll find also a video prepared by Congresswoman Katz. This was for a presentation on the treaty we gave at the UN's major annual food security conference last fall in Rome. And there are articles there on the treaty that have been published in a couple of the nation's most prestigious journals of international affairs. Jim McGovern, the co-chair of the House Hunger Caucus, has stated at a congressional briefing that this treaty is doable. And why not? The treaty doesn't mess with any country's borders, trade, commerce, military preparedness. It will alleviate overpopulation, because in general, high birth rates don't decline until high death rates decline. It will improve regional and international stability. I remember hearing a recording of President Eisenhower at the Republican National Convention. He said, "It is madness to suppose that there could be an island of tranquility and prosperity in a sea of wretchedness and frustration." That was pretty prescient. In the last year and a half, Europe has seen its tranquility and prosperity slammed as hundreds of thousands of wretched and frustrated refugees have washed up on its shores, dead and alive, having prayed for escape from hunger, sieges, and the wars that give rise to them. The treaty would even be a boon to U.S. national security. Galvanizing a coalition of the willing to end hunger would burnish our national image like nothing else. What better way to disinfect the poison that terrorists try to spew into the atmosphere about us busting our buttons in insular self-satisfaction? The treaty is doable also because it avoids entanglement in more controversial issues. The treaty's sole mission of eradicating malnutrition and starvation resonates with the universal gut-wrenching sympathy people have always felt for the hungry. Fine points of trade agreements and sustainable development plans and GMO restrictions, none of that's found in the Bible or any other sacred text. But alleviating the agony of the hungry is called for in virtually all of them. What the treaty needs to get the doable done is for enough people to follow the 8-word game plan for social change. That's pressure governments and get others to do likewise. Pressuring governments can be just a matter of contacting your head of state, your legislators, and letting them know, I'm going to hold you accountable for doing everything in your power to advance the food security treaty. Even a 4-minute campaign like that is far superior to silence. Silence is what allows politicians to slip into the warm bath of the status quo while dialing for re-election dollars. When it comes to social justice, political leaders need to be led, and particularly they need to hear from people of faith. This is the same sector of the population that pushed political leaders towards abolition 200 years ago. They anticipate that they are going to hear from extremists, so they need to gird their loins for that. People of faith can help them with that. They might hear from far leftists who will see phantoms of American imperialism everywhere they look, and the brayings of rightists who say that, well, hunger eradication is going to be too costly, or it's going to reward the lazy, or some other let-them-eat-cake excuse for mass involuntary manslaughter parading as pragmatic laissez-faire economics. And they might say, well, I don't know about supporting this treaty in its broad principle form because of the devil's in the details. Well, you trot that old adage out, and sometimes the devil is in the details, but often, and maybe even more often, the devil is in the use of that saying as an excuse for wallowing in the perverse comfort of pessimism and defending the status quo. Talking up the treaty, you might encounter objections like those, but then you counter them, and that can plant seeds that might flower someday. And along the way, you are sure to find new friends and allies who say, yeah, we got to get this thing done. This is when a person feels the exhilaration of helping to make history, whether you're acting independently or as part of a group, such as a religious congregation. And I think especially if it's pursued through collaboration between congregations, the way this initiative here in Santa Barbara has been dealing with homelessness and climate change. A Santa Barbara Interfaith Alliance backing the IFST could serve as a model far and wide, the way already Santa Barbara street medicine is becoming renowned in the international movement to provide health care for the homeless. Talk of the Food Security Treaty bubbling up from congregations here could flow on to congregations and water coolers, markets, news media in countries all over the world. There was in ancient times a Jewish sage named Hillel who asked, if not now, when? Well, I think we in Santa Barbara might as well ask, if not here, where? Santa Barbara is no major metropolis, but in social justice revolutions, starting small is no impediment to success. In fact, it's the norm. At the mid-19th century Seneca Falls Convention, the first formal demand for the right of American women to vote was signed by just 100 people. And when the first anti-slavery publication, The Liberator, hit the streets, it had a staff of just 2. Those activists and their brothers and sisters ultimately upended huge economic and social structures, and they did it without the advantage of any universal declaration, or scripture, or broadcasting, or cell phones, or internet. The IFST has all those tools to obliterate a horror nobody says should continue. Hunger has no religion defending it. The hunger holocaust has no Axis armies requiring the sacrifice of millions of soldiers to defeat it. There was a UN leader who came to the USCSB a number of years back, and he was asked if the time for the treaty was right, and he said, no, and it won't get right unless people like you campaign for it. He said, initiatives like this need to be championed by small groups of people who have strong convictions and are prepared to prevail against the general mood of apathy. Great mass movements don't start with great masses. Like snowballs, they accumulate mass and momentum as they get rolling. Anyone who doubts that hunger could be rolled in a couple of decades should consider that in 1988, the Soviet Union and apartheid seemed as immutable as the Rock of Gibraltar, and polio was still attacking 1,000 more children every day. Now, this was decades after the vaccines had been developed. But in that year, anti-polio campaigners reshaped the mindset of the World Health Assembly, and they got them to move on the global polio eradication initiative. And within 15 years, new cases of polio dropped 99.8%. I tried to put the data in the chart, but it's too small to see. And by then, of course, the Soviet Union and apartheid were long buried in history's famous garbage heap. Ending world hunger is the greatest achievable moonshot we've got. Pull this one off once we set our minds to it, and hunger eradication doesn't require a decade or even a day of technological innovation. What it requires is a law-changing shockwave of the kind that's always propelled social justice revolutions. Here is how shockwaves work in the physical realm. This is a star nursery in the Triangular Galaxy. A couple hundred stars become energized enough to trigger shockwaves that compress nearby gas that ignites new stars. And so it goes in the social physics, the paradigm shifts. A small number of energy sources, that can be any of us, can trigger in others the thunder-striking sense that what had seemed impossible is possible. This is about power. Michael Pollan, just a couple weeks ago in the New York Times, wrote, policy and politics seldom move before the larger culture does. When that happens, it can sweep away everything in its path. We have power, like Lincoln said, even we here have the power and bear the responsibility in giving freedom to the slave. And so even we here in Santa Barbara can seize the opportunity that IFST offers us to eradicate hunger. We could just click the remote and allow civilization to slide a little further into self-destructive inhumanity. But, to paraphrase Buckminster Fuller, if we do end hunger on this planet, either we'll become the only intelligent species between here and there who pulled it off, or we'll join others that have already done so, but in either case, the thought is staggering. Let's imagine that we do manage to shake our species free of its paralysis and wrestle hunger to the ground over 15 years. So it's 2031, and the IFST has been up and running. And the malnutrition chart looks like that polio chart I showed you, that's 15th year bar down, nearly 100%. In the wake of that, so you've got death rates plummeting and population stabilizing. In the wake of that, environmental and social pressures are easing. And oh, by the way, hundreds of millions of healthy working people have escaped the stunting of their bodies and their lives and their spirits. And the well-fed have escaped the thundercloud of guilt that's hung over us as we gagged on the specious claim that the hunger plague will always be with us. Imagine a child of yours, or a grandchild, or a great-grandchild, and the kid at that time is looking at the History Channel and sees appalling images of the world's last terrible starvation from long before. And the kid's flabbergasted, asks you to explain, how could the world let this happen? Or you'd be the first generation ever that's been able to say, yeah, that is the way it was, and for a long time, but my friends and I in Santa Barbara helped put a stop to it. Imagine being a child raised by people who could say that, knowing that we had taken command of the millennial scourge and whacked it. And finally, we should consider the imaginings of a group of artists from many faiths and lands envision the treaty's journey in its own animated short film.